The rain fell in sheets across Tokyo that October evening in 1944, drumming against the windows of the Imperial Navy headquarters like the fingers of restless spirits. Inside the conference room, beneath the harsh glare of electric lights, Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi stood before a map of the Philippine Islands, his shadow stretching long across the wall. The map was marked with red circles and crossed lines, each notation a testament to losses that could no longer be hidden behind official communiques and victory announcements. The men gathered around the polished wooden table wore expressions carved from stone. They had seen the intelligence reports. They knew what the others in the room knew, but what the Japanese people did not yet comprehend. The war was slipping through their fingers like water, and conventional tactics had become little more than elaborate methods of delay. Onishi's hand moved across the map, tracing the American advance northward through the Pacific. Each island name he spoke landed in the silence like a stone dropped into deep water. Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Tinian. The Americans had not merely taken these islands, they had annihilated the defending forces with a ruthlessness born of industrial might and technological superiority. Japanese aircraft carriers, once the pride of the combined fleet, now rested on the ocean floor. The pilots, who had trained for years, who had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating precision, were dead. Their replacements were boys with barely enough flight hours to take off and land. The Vice Admiral paused at the Philippines, his finger hovering over Leyte Gulf. Intelligence indicated General Douglas MacArthur would make his return there, backed by a fleet so massive it blotted out the horizon. Against such force, what could Japan throw into battle? Outdated aircraft? Pilots who struggled to maintain formation? Ships running on fuel reserves that dwindled with each passing day? In the corner of the room, Captain Eiichiro Jyo sat with his hands folded on the table before him, his face a careful mask. He had flown combat missions over China, had seen friends consumed by fire and shrapnel, had pulled his aircraft from dives that left his vision black at the edges. He understood what Onishi was building toward with his measured words and pregnant pauses. The other officers might still cling to hope, to the possibility that one decisive battle could turn the tide, but Jyo had seen too much to harbor such illusions. The numbers told a story that no amount of Bushido spirit could rewrite. American pilots trained for 18 months before seeing combat. Japanese pilots now received 6 months, if they were fortunate, sometimes less. American aircraft factories produced thousands of planes each month. Japanese production facilities, bombed by B-29s operating from newly captured bases, struggled to maintain a fraction of that output. American carriers sailed with fighter squadrons numbering in the dozens. Japanese carriers, those that remained, scraped together whatever aircraft could be spared. Onishi's voice cut through the silence, low and steady. He spoke of mathematical realities. In conventional aerial combat, even under optimal conditions, perhaps 1 in 10 Japanese aircraft might successfully strike an American carrier. The pilots faced walls of anti-aircraft fire so dense it turned the sky black. They confronted American fighters, Hellcats and Corsairs, that outperformed Japanese aircraft in nearly every measure. They fought exhausted, hungry, operating on whatever fuel could be requisitioned. But what if, Onishi asked, the aircraft itself became the weapon? What if instead of dropping a bomb that might miss, that might be shot down by defensive fire, the pilot guided his plane directly into the target? The mathematics transformed. A dive bomber carried perhaps 500 pounds of explosives. The aircraft itself, fully fueled, became a missile weighing thousands of pounds, traveling at hundreds of miles per hour, guided by human eyes and hands until the final instant of impact. The room remained silent, but the quality of that silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of men awaiting information. It was the silence of men confronting an abyss. Onishi continued, his words carefully chosen. He did not speak of suicide. He spoke of special attack units, of devoted officers who would sacrifice themselves to inflict maximum damage on the enemy, of young men raised in a culture that revered self-sacrifice, who had absorbed since childhood the stories of the 47 Ronin, of warriors who chose death over dishonor. These pilots would not be throwing their lives away. They would be exchanging them for strategic advantage at a moment when Japan possessed little else to trade. Captain Jyo listened and thought of the young pilots he had seen in training, boys really, barely old enough to shave, who bowed with such earnest formality and called him sensei. He thought of their families, of mothers who would receive telegrams written in the formal language of heroic sacrifice. He thought of what it would mean to ask these boys to climb into their cockpits, knowing they would not return, that their mission plans included no route home. One of the senior admirals shifted in his seat, breaking the tableau. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of age and exhaustion. He asked the question that hung unspoken in the air. What choice remained? The Americans would not negotiate. They had declared they would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. Every day brought their bombers closer to the home islands. Every week saw more young men conscripted, more rice requisitioned, more families pressed into factory work producing weapons that could not match American technology. Onishi presented his proposal with the precision of an engineer outlining specifications. The first air fleet would form special attack units, Shinpu, Tokubetsu, Kogekitai, later transliterated by Americans as Kamikaze. The name invoked the divine wind that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries before. Pilots would volunteer, though everyone in the room understood the fiction of volunteering when commanders asked for heroes and entire squadrons stepped forward together, when refusing meant dishonoring one's unit and family. The aircraft would be loaded with explosives, stripped of unnecessary weight. Pilots would aim for aircraft carriers and large warships, targets whose destruction would cripple American naval operations. Each successful attack would remove not just the ship itself, but the aircraft it carried, the pilots it supported, the logistics it enabled. The Americans could replace ships, certainly, but replacement took time, and time was the commodity Japan desperately needed. Time to fortify the home islands, time to exhaust American will, time for some miracle, some shift in global politics that might preserve the empire in some diminished form. The discussion that followed came in careful, measured tones. Officers raised technical questions about aircraft selection, fuel loads, optimal approach vectors. They discussed how to identify volunteers, how to train them for this singular mission that permitted no practice runs, no second chances. They debated whether to inform the pilots of their mission beforehand or to wait until the last moment, whether honesty or surprise would better serve. No one spoke the deeper truth that pressed against the walls of that conference room. That this decision represented an acknowledgement that conventional victory had become impossible. Traditional tactics assumed pilots who survived could fly again, who gained experience that made them more lethal over time. This new tactic consumed its practitioners in their first deployment. It was not a strategy for winning a war. It was a strategy for making victory as expensive as possible for the enemy, for buying time measured in weeks and months rather than years. Captain Jyo thought about the training he would need to conduct. How did one prepare a pilot for a mission that ended in certain death? What skills mattered when there would be no landing, no post-mission debriefing, no lessons carried forward? The training would focus on approach angles, on evading defensive fire until the last possible moment, on selecting the optimal impact point. It would be training stripped to its essential, brutal core. The meeting extended into the early hours of morning. Rain continued its assault on the windows, matching the relentless pressure of decisions that could not be avoided. Maps were consulted, production figures reviewed, intelligence estimates questioned. But the fundamental calculation remained unchanged. Japan's conventional military capabilities were eroding daily. Something had to give the Americans pause, had to impose costs that might make them reconsider their advance, their demands for unconditional surrender. When Onishi finally called for a decision, the votes came quietly, each officer responding in turn. There were no speeches, no dramatic declarations. These were men worn down by months of defeats and retreating defensive lines. They voted for the special attack units, not from bloodlust or fanaticism, but from a grim understanding that alternatives had narrowed to a vanishing point. As the meeting concluded and officers filed out into the pre-dawn darkness, Jyo remained behind, studying the map of the Philippines. Somewhere in those islands, young pilots were sleeping, unaware that their commanders had just redefined the nature of their service. Within days, officers would arrive at air bases with new orders. Within weeks, the first special attack units would launch toward American carriers, their fuel tanks filled only enough for a one-way journey. The decision made that night would send thousands of young men to their deaths in the months that followed. Some would strike their targets, their aircraft punching through carrier decks and exploding in hangar bays. Others would be shot down short of their objectives, their sacrifices noted only in American after-action reports. The campaign would shock American forces, would demonstrate a willingness to accept casualties that defied Western military logic, but it would not alter the war's fundamental trajectory. Jyo understood this as he stood alone in the conference room. The divine wind invoked by the special attack unit's name would not save Japan as the original Kamikaze had saved it from the Mongols. This was not the 13th century, and faith alone could not stop the industrial might arrayed against them. But perhaps, and this was the thin hope that justified the decision, perhaps it would impose enough cost, enough psychological impact, to create some opening for negotiation, some path that avoided the complete destruction of Japan. He gathered his papers and walked into the rain-soaked morning. Across Tokyo, across Japan, young men slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams young men dream. In the weeks ahead, some of them would receive special training, would write final letters to their families, would tie ceremonial headbands around their flight helmets before climbing into aircraft that carried no landing gear. They would become statistics, names on monuments, symbols invoked in propaganda, and later debated by historians. But on that October morning, as Jyo made his way through empty streets, they were simply sleeping boys who would wake to discover their commanders had decided that conventional warfare no longer served, that Japan's last option required transforming pilots into weapons, men into missiles, individuals into instruments of a desperate strategic calculus, born from the acknowledgement that the war, in any meaningful sense, was already lost. The rain continued falling, washing away nothing, changing nothing, simply marking time as Japan committed itself to a path that would add a new word to military vocabulary and a new sorrow to the ledger of human conflict.